If, in the very heart of America, there once stood a city larger than medieval London, and it vanished without a trace, how different might the nation be today? Imagine that for a moment, as you settle into the quiet of the evening, a city of earth and sky, bustling with tens of thousands of people, rose on the banks of the Mississippi. Its mounds reached upward like silent pyramids, shaping the horizon long before the steel towers of Chicago or New York. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it slipped into silence, leaving only grassy hills behind. This is not a tale of legend or myth, but of a place that still rests beneath the soil of Illinois. The first glimpse of this forgotten city in the written record came in 1811. That year, Henry Brackenridge, a curious explorer and observer of the early American frontier, stood before the largest of its structures. He described it with awe and puzzlement, calling it the Pyramid of America. What he saw was not a natural hill, but a monumental earthwork built by human hands. Brackenridge wrote of its scale and symmetry, hinting that it must have belonged to a society far more complex than most people of his time could imagine. His words were among the earliest attempts to bring attention to the immense mounds that dotted the landscape, reminders of a civilization whose story had nearly been erased. More than a century and a half later, in 1964, the United States took a step toward honoring this heritage. The area, long overlooked and misunderstood, was declared a National Historic Landmark. This recognition marked a turning point. For the first time, the mounds were formally protected, and the site began to emerge from obscurity. What had once been dismissed as mere earthworks of little importance was now understood to be the remains of a major pre-Columbian city. Scholars, archaeologists, and everyday visitors started to see that the quiet fields carried a story that could reshape how Americans viewed their own past. Yet even with this recognition, the story of Cahokia, as the site came to be known, remained mostly absent from classrooms and textbooks. Generations of Americans grew up never hearing that their homeland had once hosted a city of such magnitude. It was easier, perhaps, to imagine America as a land awaiting discovery, rather than a land already shaped by great urban centers. The silence around Cahokia allowed myths of emptiness to linger, even as the evidence stood in plain sight just across the river from modern Street Louis. And so the mounds remained, grassy and still, keeping their secrets. To most who drove past on the highway, they looked like nothing more than rolling hills. But to those who paused to walk their slopes, they spoke of an ancient order, a rhythm of life and belief that once guided thousands of people. The ground itself held the memory of markets, rituals, and gatherings long forgotten. Behind these mounds lies not only a story of human ingenuity, but also mysteries scholars are still trying to solve. Why did such a city rise here, in the heart of the Mississippi Valley? How did its people organize, build, and thrive? And most haunting of all, why did it vanish? These questions linger in the twilight between history and speculation, waiting to be explored. Tonight, we open the door to that forgotten world. A world where a city once stood tall, where people lived and dreamed, and where their traces remain beneath the earth. Beyond the quiet grass lies a lost civilization, hidden from America's story for far too long. And as we step closer to its mysteries, we begin to see how its presence and its disappearance still echo through the nation's history. If you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to do so, and join us for more historical mysteries. Do not forget to like this video and tell us which mystery you would like us to explore next. And remember, the story you are hearing is only a historical assumption, not absolute truth. The information we share is grounded in archaeological research and mainstream sources, with a few thoughtful hypotheses for you to reflect on. When we look across the flatlands of southern Illinois today, it is hard to imagine the scale of what once stood there. The land seems ordinary, fields stretching out beneath the sky, highways running their endless lines of traffic. But beneath this quiet surface lies a story of beginnings, a city that rose and fell long before modern America took shape. To understand Cahokia, we must first trace its origins, not through legends or imagination, but through the careful record of archaeology. Archaeologists tell us that the first permanent communities appeared here around the year 600 of the Common Era. At that time, the landscape was shaped by the wide Mississippi River and its fertile floodplains. People came to live along its edges, cultivating maize, beans, and squash. These were not yet the grand builders of earthworks, but small farming groups who discovered that the land could sustain larger populations. Over centuries, their villages multiplied, clustered along waterways, and grew in size and density. The soil, tested and dated in excavations carried out from the 1962 onward, confirms that human occupation became heavier with time. By the year 1050, something remarkable had happened. The scattered communities had transformed into an urban centre, swelling with tens of thousands of inhabitants. This was the beginning of Cahokia's peak, a period that lasted roughly from 1050 to 1200, when it became the largest and most complex city north of Mexico. But the story also has its shadows. By 1350 to 1400, evidence shows decline, fewer houses, reduced population, and abandonment of the great plazas. Archaeological timelines mark this as the era when Cahokia faded into silence, its growth reversed, its momentum lost. These dates, 600 for the first arrivals, 1050 to 1200 for the peak, and 1350 to 1400 for the decline, form the backbone of Cahokia's history as reconstructed through science. Our recognition of Cahokia, however, did not begin with radiocarbon analysis. It began with the eyes and hands of early archaeologists who saw the mounds and asked what they were. In the 1922, Warren King Moorhead undertook excavations at the site. At that time, archaeology was still developing in America, and Moorhead's work stood out. He turned his attention to Monks Mound, the largest of the surviving earthworks. What he found confirmed what local communities had always known, that this was no natural hill. It was a human creation, the largest earthen structure in North America. Moorhead described a mound that rose more than 30 meters high and stretched across several acres. He marveled at the sheer volume of soil moved by hand, a testament to labor on a scale unfamiliar in the American past as it was then understood. His excavations were among the first systematic efforts to document Cahokia scientifically, and they gave the site a place within national awareness. To Moorhead, Monks Mound was proof that North America's ancient inhabitants were capable of extraordinary feats, a revelation that challenged older ideas which had underestimated indigenous societies. Time and technology would add new layers of understanding. Nearly a century later, in 2017, researchers at the University of Illinois used LiDAR scanning to survey the entire landscape. LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, sends pulses of laser light from aircraft to measure the ground below. It can strip away vegetation and reveal features invisible to the naked eye. When the Cahokia site was scanned, the images revealed a sprawling settlement more than 13 square kilometers wide. Within that expanse were not just mounds, but outlines of streets, neighborhoods, and a planned layout. The LiDAR survey confirmed that Cahokia was not a loose scatter of earthworks, but a true city, organized with intention. The precision of its urban grid spoke of careful planning, and the vast footprint testified to the thousands who once lived there. What Moorhead had seen in a single mound was now visible across the entire landscape, a city as broad and complex as any in the medieval world. But Cahokia's story has not always been told through archaeology alone. In the late 19th century, long before carbon dating or LiDAR existed, speculation often filled the gaps in knowledge. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly published his famous book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was a work of imagination, linking myths of a sunken continent with ruins across the globe. Donnelly claimed that Cahokia's mounds might have been built by Atlanteans who fled their drowned homeland. To his readers, it was a captivating vision, a lost people carrying their knowledge to distant lands, building monumental works, and leaving behind clues to their vanished greatness. Donnelly's claims were not grounded in excavation or evidence. They reflected instead a 19th century habit of explaining the monuments of the Americas as the work of outsiders, rather than the ancestors of native peoples. His theory belonged to what would later be called forbidden history, stories that appeal to mystery but lie outside the bounds of mainstream scholarship. Though discredited by archaeologists, Donnelly's words lingered in popular culture, shaping how many Americans thought about the mounds for decades. Modern anthropology has answered those claims, with evidence from the soil and from living traditions. In 2019, new research reaffirmed what decades of excavation had already made clear. Cahokia was not the work of Atlantean refugees, nor of any vanished race. It was a creation of indigenous peoples, built by those who lived along the Mississippi and drew upon their own cultural knowledge. The pottery, the tools, the burials, and the architectural styles all fit within the continuum of local traditions. No outside source was needed to explain the city's rise. This conclusion is more than academic. It restores credit to the native peoples whose ancestors shaped the land, affirming that Cahokia belongs firmly to the history of North America's First Nations. In this way, the origins of Cahokia are traced along two parallel lines: the slow uncovering of evidence through archaeology and the shifting interpretations that people have placed upon it. And so, having traced the beginnings of Cahokia through time and through the lenses of both science and speculation, we stand at the edge of a city that once thrived in the heart of America. Its foundations are visible in dates, in excavations, and in the shape of the land itself. What remains is to move beyond origins into the fabric of life, the achievements, the culture, and the daily rhythms of the people who built and sustained this great city. If you are still here, give this video a like to let us know you are listening. At its height, Cahokia stood as a city of astonishing scale, larger than most would imagine possible in the ancient American Midwest. Archaeologists estimate that between 10 and 20,000 people lived within its limits, and during its peak the population may have climbed as high as 40,000. Timothy Porketat, writing in 2015, emphasized that these numbers rivaled the great medieval centers of Europe. To walk into Cahokia around the year 1100 was to step into a metropolis alive with energy, a place where thousands of lives converged in a rhythm of farming, building, trade, and ritual. At the very heart of the city rose Monks Mound, a massive platform of earth that remains the largest structure of its kind in North America. Built in 4 major stages between 900 and 1200, it reached a height of nearly 30 meters, with a base that spread across 5 hectares. Its volume has been calculated at more than 700,000 cubic meters of soil, each basket carried by hand. To imagine its construction is to picture a human river of workers, carrying earth day after day, year after year, transforming the flat floodplain into a monument that dominated the horizon. From its summit, leaders could survey not only the city itself, but the miles of countryside beyond. Monks Mound was more than an elevated platform. It was the center of political and spiritual authority, the beating heart of Cahokia's identity. Surrounding this monumental core were neighborhoods filled with houses made of wattle and daub. Their walls were plastered with clay, their roofs thatched with reeds. Smoke from hearth fires rose into the air, carrying the scent of maize being roasted or fish cooking from the river. The city was sustained by an agricultural system that reached a level of intensity never before seen in this region. In 1971, archaeologists unearthed carbonized kernels of maize, silent witnesses to fields that once stretched outward from the city. These discoveries proved that Cahokia's economy depended on large-scale farming, enough to feed tens of thousands. Agriculture was the foundation that allowed society to diversify. Some people farmed, others built, some led ceremonies, and others crafted tools. Without those fields of maize, Cahokia could never have risen beyond scattered villages. Daily life in the city reflected both cooperation and hierarchy. Families lived close together, forming clusters that created a sense of neighborhood identity. Children played in open spaces while elders told stories that connected them to their ancestors. But excavations also reveal that not all lives were equal. Archaeologists working in the late 1962 uncovered evidence that society here was not egalitarian. Certain burial mounds revealed individuals interred with ornaments and crafted objects that set them apart from others. These findings showed that Cahokia had a ruling class, supported by ceremonies and displays of status. Leadership was marked not only by authority in life, but also by the symbols chosen to accompany them into death, clear signs that power and hierarchy were woven into the city's daily order. The grandeur of Cahokia was not limited to what lay beneath the ground. It also reached upward into the skies. In 1961, archaeologists identified a ring of large wooden posts arranged in a circle with a diameter of about 400 feet. They named it Woodhenge, a structure tied to the movements of the Sunday. From within this circle, observers could watch as the sun rose in perfect alignment with specific posts at solstices and equinoxes. These alignments provided a calendar, a way of marking the cycles of planting and harvest. Yet Woodhenge was not only a tool, it was also a place of gathering, where the community could witness cosmic order brought down to earth. To stand in that circle on the morning of a solstice, with the sun rising over the horizon, must have been a powerful experience, binding the rhythms of heaven to the rhythms of life. Cahokia was a place of innovation, but also of imagination. Its builders conceived of their city not only in practical terms but also in symbolic ones. The arrangement of plazas, the alignment of mounds, and the placement of Woodhenge spoke of a worldview where earth and sky were connected. The city's organization reflected both the needs of daily living and the deeper needs of meaning and ceremony. The people who carried soil to build Monks Mound or planted maize in the fields were part of a society that fused the material and the spiritual, making Cahokia a city unlike any other in the Americas. Modern scholars have returned to Cahokia with new interpretations that challenge earlier assumptions. In 2009, Timothy Porketat argued that it was best described not merely as a settlement, but as a ritual megacity. His phrase captures the dual nature of the place. It was both urban and ceremonial, both practical and sacred. It was a city where daily life was infused with ritual significance, where the rhythms of farming and building were tied to the turning of the sun and the authority of leaders. To call it a village, as older narratives sometimes did, is to diminish its scale. To call it a megacity is to recognize that Cahokia stood shoulder to shoulder with the great urban centers of its age, even if it was made not of stone but of earth. The soil of Cahokia has preserved many things, but it has not preserved certainty. What archaeologists began to uncover in the 20th century often raised more questions than it answered. Some discoveries suggested practices both fascinating and disturbing. Others seemed to point toward knowledge that demanded explanation. In every case, the evidence left a space into which imagination quickly flowed. In 1967, excavation at Mound 72 revealed a scene of striking complexity. More than 270 burials lay beneath its surface, an arrangement unlike any found before in North America. Among these graves, many belonged to young women, interred together in mass pits. Some bodies were carefully positioned, others placed without ceremony. Scholars studying the patterns concluded that these were not ordinary deaths. The possibility of ritual sacrifice emerged, tied to ceremonies of leadership and power. At the center lay the burial of a man covered in beads made from marine shells, a sign of authority elevated beyond ordinary life. Around him, the sacrificed became part of his final rite. The details sparked intense debate. Was this an act of devotion, of violence, or of cosmic symbolism? Archaeology could reveal the bones and their arrangement, but the reasons for their presence remained concealed in silence. Another layer of mystery emerged a few years earlier, in 1961, when archaeologists identified a ring of post holes west of Monks Mound. The circle, more than 400 feet across, became known as Woodhenge. Its design was not random. From the center point, the posts aligned precisely with the rising sun at solstices and equinoxes. This meant that Cahokia's builders had not only observed the heavens carefully, but had committed those observations into monumental form. To stand in the circle on the shortest day of winter was to watch the sun rise directly over a designated post, marking the turning of the year. Such precision led to questions. Was Woodhenge a solar calendar to guide planting and harvest? Was it a sacred theatre where the sun's power was celebrated in ritual gatherings? Or was it both? A union of practical timekeeping and cosmic ceremony? The posts themselves vanished long ago, but their sockets, preserved in the earth, testified to deliberate alignment. The design suggested intention beyond simple utility. This kind of alignment became fertile ground for writers who sought explanations outside conventional history. In 1968, Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods, a book that argued ancient civilizations had been influenced by extraterrestrial visitors. The idea was provocative and quickly gained wide readership. Von Däniken pointed to monuments from Egypt to South America, claiming their accuracy and massive scale were proof of outside help. Within this framework, structures like Woodhenge seemed to fit. If Cahokia's posts tracked the sun so precisely, perhaps, he suggested, its builders had received guidance from beings beyond the earth. Archaeologists rejected this notion. Decades later, in 2009, a team from the University of Illinois studied Woodhenge again, showing that its alignments fit within indigenous traditions. The posts, they argued, were tools of ritual and observation, designed through careful watching of the sun across seasons. No outside knowledge was needed. What appeared mysterious to some was, in fact, the result of generations of observation and cultural expression. The debate revealed two contrasting lenses, one seeking the extraordinary explanation of alien contact, the other showing the extraordinary capacities of human communities on their own. The allure of mystery, however, long predated the debates of the 1,960 seconds. In 1894, American newspapers described Cahokia as the American Pyramid City. The headline was crafted to capture attention, evoking images of Egypt and grandeur. For readers across the country, the comparison suggested that North America had once hosted a civilization equal in scale to the wonders of the Old World. The language was sensational, but it also reflected a gap in understanding. The mounds were not recognized as the achievements of native peoples. They were framed instead as relics of a vanished and alien presence. The Pyramid City label transformed an archaeological site into a mythic curiosity, designed more to sell papers than to inform. Over time, Cahokia continued to drift between fact and imagination, its image reshaped by the culture around it. In 2004, a new generation encountered it not in textbooks or excavation reports, but in the digital world of Civilization 4. The strategy game introduced Cahokia as a city-state, placing it alongside famous centers of ancient power. To players, it appeared as a mysterious remnant, a symbol of a lost world whose significance was felt even if its details remained obscure. Through pixels and gameplay, Cahokia's aura of enigma reached millions who may never have heard of it otherwise. The portrayal was not precise archaeology, but it cemented the site's place in the modern imagination as both vanished and unforgettable. Each of these episodes, the sacrificial burials of 1,967, the celestial alignments identified in 1961, the extraterrestrial claims of 1,968, the scholarly rebuttal of 2009, the journalistic flourish of 1,894, and the digital revival of 2004 deepened the sense of Cahokia as a place surrounded by questions. Some of those questions may one day be answered by science. Others belong to the realm of speculation, sustained by the human desire to wonder at what is unknown. The site itself remains silent. It is in the interpretations, both careful and wild, that its mysteries continue to live. Stay with us until the end, as we uncover the mysteries of Cahokia and reflect on what they mean for the story of America. The story of Cahokia does not end with a single catastrophe, but with a series of mysteries that scholars have tried to untangle for more than a century. What remains today are fragments of evidence, theories formed in different decades, and echoes carried in native traditions. Each explanation offers a glimpse into what might have brought silence to a city that once thrived with tens of thousands. In the 1,930 seconds, one of the earliest academic explanations focused on the possibility of war. Scholars looked at the traces of palisade walls discovered around parts of Cahokia and saw signs of conflict. Tall wooden fortifications ringed key areas, suggesting defense against an enemy, or perhaps a way to separate factions within the city. The idea of tribal warfare, or even civil strife within Cahokia itself, seemed plausible. With thousands living close together, rival groups might have fought for power or resources. Scholars of the 1,930 seconds imagined scenes of warriors clashing in the shadow of the mounds, a city divided by tension. While physical evidence of conflict is limited, the image of a society fractured from within has remained one possible key to understanding its decline. Decades later, science shifted attention from human conflict to the natural world. In 1997, a team of researchers extracted sediment cores from the Mississippi floodplain, analyzing layers of pollen and silt preserved in the earth. They found evidence of a prolonged drought between 1,350 and 1,450. For a community so dependent on maize agriculture, such a drought would have been devastating. Fields once full of grain would have withered, stalks left dry under the relentless Sunday streams, and ponds may have shrunk, leaving little water for people or crops. Archaeologists imagined families watching their storage pits empty, rituals performed to call back the rains, villages sending their young men and women further afield in search of food. The sediment told a stark story that climate itself could have eroded the foundations of Cahokia's urban life. But drought alone may not have been enough. In 2007, a demographic study suggested that disease was another invisible force. In a city where tens of thousands shared water, food, and space, illness could spread swiftly. Trade networks may have introduced new pathogens into a population with no natural immunity. Sickness may have swept through neighborhoods, weakening families already strained by hunger. The archaeological record cannot reveal the names of these diseases, but demographic patterns pointed to a collapse too rapid to be explained by climate alone. Scholars imagined fevers leaving households empty, healers overwhelmed, and communities losing the strength to maintain the labor systems that once supported mounds and plazas. The picture grew even more complex with new research in the 21st century. In 2022, a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined environmental stresses facing Cahokia in its final centuries. Evidence pointed to repeated flooding along the Mississippi River, which destroyed homes and stripped fertile soil from fields. Heavy rains alternated with droughts, creating cycles of instability. The land that once supported immense harvests now betrayed those who depended on it. Farmers would have seen their efforts undone again and again, the promise of stability replaced by frustration and uncertainty. The study suggested that this environmental volatility compounded the effects of drought, leaving Cahokia's residents in a landscape that no longer met the needs of their vast community. Beyond data and studies, there are voices carried in tradition. The Osage people, descendants of communities linked to the Mississippi Valley, tell stories of an abandoned city built by the ancestors. In these oral histories, the mounds were not lifeless ruins but part of a remembered landscape, a place once alive that was later left behind. Around fires, elders spoke of a city whose builders moved on, its meaning shifting into legend. These accounts do not give dates or scientific causes. Instead, they offer a human memory of departure, of a place once full that became empty. For those who inherit the stories, Cahokia's silence is not simply a puzzle but part of a longer journey of their people. Taken separately, each explanation opens a window into a possible past. Scholars of the 1,930 seconds imagined conflict tearing the city apart. Sediment cores in 1997 revealed the weight of drought. Demographic studies in 2007 traced the outlines of epidemic disease. Climate research in 2022 showed how floods and erosion deepened the crisis. Oral tradition preserved by the Osage recalled abandonment in words older than science. None tells the whole story, yet each deepens the sense that Cahokia's disappearance was shaped by forces both human and natural, by struggles within and by challenges beyond human control. What remains is not certainty, but the recognition that the city's end was as complex as its life had been. Cahokia may have fallen silent centuries ago, but its presence has never fully vanished. The great mounds still rise from the Mississippi floodplain, and over time they have gained recognition not only as relics of the past, but as markers of meaning for the present. In 1982, the site was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Property. With that designation, Cahokia joined the company of monuments like the Pyramids of Giza and the Great Wall of China. For the first time, an ancient North American city was acknowledged on the same stage as the world's most celebrated civilizations. The recognition carried more than honor. It signaled that Cahokia's legacy belonged not only to native descendants or to Illinois, but to humanity as a whole. Visitors who walk the grounds today follow in the footsteps of people whose achievements had long been underestimated, now restored to global memory. The rediscovery of Cahokia has not been confined to archaeology or heritage listings. In 2005, Charles Mann published 1,491 New Revelations of the Americas. Before Columbus, a book that reshaped the way many Americans thought about their continent's past. Mann highlighted Cahokia as proof that the Americas before European contact were not empty lands dotted with small villages, but places where cities and civilizations flourished. His work reached a wide audience, shifting public consciousness. Readers encountered the idea that North America once held a metropolis whose scale rivaled medieval London. For many, this overturned the narrative they had absorbed in school, where indigenous societies were too often portrayed as scattered and simple. Mann's book made Cahokia part of a new conversation about the depth and complexity of pre-Columbian life. Television carried the message further. In 2010, PBS broadcast Native America, a series that brought the story of Cahokia into millions of homes across the United States. Viewers who might never have visited Illinois saw animated reconstructions of the city, its plazas filled with people, its mounds crowned with ceremonial structures. The program framed Cahokia not as a footnote but as a central chapter in the story of the continent. Families watched together, many encountering for the first time the idea that America's landscape had once been shaped by urban centers long before the arrival of Columbus. In living rooms across the country, Cahokia re-entered the imagination of a nation. Beyond popular culture, Cahokia has also become a lesson for the present. Universities now use its history as a case study in environmental courses. At Harvard in 2018, classes on climate and sustainability examined Cahokia's rise and collapse as an example of how human societies interact with fragile landscapes. Students considered how drought, floods, and soil erosion challenged the city, and how its story resonates with the environmental dilemmas of today. In these classrooms, Cahokia functions not as a distant curiosity but as a mirror. Its fate shows that even large, complex societies are vulnerable when climate and land use push beyond limits. The past, preserved in mounds and pollen samples, speaks directly to the challenges of the present century. Cahokia also carries a lesson about society and identity. For too long, mainstream narratives suggested that native peoples of North America lived only in small, scattered groups. The archaeological evidence of Cahokia overturns this assumption. Here was a city with tens of thousands of residents, monumental architecture, and organized social life. Its very existence proves that indigenous societies could achieve levels of complexity comparable to Europe of the same era. Recognizing this truth reshapes the story of America. It reveals that the land was never empty, nor were its people incapable of grandeur. To acknowledge Cahokia is to acknowledge that urbanism, hierarchy, and innovation were not imported, but also grew from the soil of the Mississippi Valley. And yet, the most haunting legacy of Cahokia may lie in the question of what might have been. Imagine for a moment that the city had not declined around 1,400. Picture, instead, a great metropolis continuing to thrive as Europeans crossed the Atlantic. Cahokia might have stood as a native New York centuries before the Dutch built their settlement on Manhattan. Its plazas and temples could have served as the center of a political and religious empire stretching across the Mississippi watershed. Instead of fragmented tribes, European colonists might have faced a powerful urban state, negotiating not with scattered leaders, but with rulers who commanded thousands. The balance of power in the 16th and 17th centuries would have been radically different. In such a scenario, American identity might also look different today. If Cahokia had endured, native traditions could have remained at the core of national culture rather than being pushed to the margins. Languages, rituals, and city-building philosophies might have blended with those brought from Europe, creating a hybrid identity rooted equally in indigenous and colonial worlds. Instead of a story that often casts native peoples as victims of conquest, the narrative might have been one of coexistence with a formidable urban tradition. Modern America might have inherited not only the grid of Manhattan but also the ceremonial plazas of Cahokia, reminders that the nation was shaped by more than one path of civilization. Some anthropologists have even framed this possibility in speculative terms. In 2020, scholars suggested that if Cahokia had not collapsed, the United States today might have developed alongside a strong indigenous urban tradition, one that could have altered the course of politics, economics, and culture. This is not a claim grounded in direct evidence, but in the recognition of how power shifts history. A surviving Cahokia could have changed the very map of North America, forcing European settlers to confront not empty land but a rival civilization. The thought remains hypothetical, but it underlines how much was lost when the city declined. If you are still with us, share your thoughts. If Cahokia had endured, how might America's history have unfolded differently? In 1811, the explorer Henry Brackenridge stood before Monks Mound and called it a pyramid of America. More than 2 centuries later, many of the surrounding mounds remain unexcavated, their secrets still sealed beneath the soil of Illinois. What lies within them is unknown. Some archaeologists believe the earth still holds hidden chambers, untouched burials, or entire structures that could transform our understanding of this lost city. The mystery deepens when we consider that Cahokia may not have been alone. Across the Midwest, traces of other mound complexes dot the landscape. Many have been eroded or ploughed under. Many remain unexplored. Could there be other Cahokias, buried beneath farmland and suburbs, waiting in silence for the moment of discovery? If so, then the story of America's beginnings is larger than we think, stretching far beyond the timelines taught in classrooms. And so the question remains, if beneath our very feet entire cities still sleep in the soil, where does the true history of America begin? If you have stayed with us until now, give this video a like to let us know you are listening. Subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of history, and share in the comments which secret you would like us to explore next. For now, sleep well, and until next time, good night.